There is a real-life resource a society needs to accumulate to spawn Jesus, not unlike in Sid Meier's Civilization. Between the 8th and 2nd century BC, something quite miraculous happened. All around the world, completely independently, a new kind of religions and philosophies arose. As opposed to the older religions, which emphasized ritualism, tribal taboos, and the appeasement of the will of angry volatile gods through sacrifices, these new movements talked about the value of asceticism and moderation. They talked about ethical values of peace and charity. And finally, they talked about transcendent spiritual universe, which provided grace and salvation for those willing to live according to the new moral standards. Around the 6th century in ancient China, we see the rise of highly ethical teachings of Confucius, and also the more esoteric mystical tradition of Taoism. In the 5th century in India, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha formulates his vision of enlightenment and the ethical framework necessary for achieving it, while his contemporary Mahavira reforms the philosophy of nonviolence known as Jainism. Even the much older Vedic tradition undergoes transformation under these influences through the movement of ascetic shramans as described in the late Vedic texts known as Upanishads. And, in the same time, in ancient Greece the philosopher Socrates upstarted the Hellenic miracle, later transitioning into such Western philosophical staples as is Platonism or Stoicism. Finally, in the Middle East, older Jewish religion underwent reform to so-called Second Temple Judaism, whose messianic tendencies eventually resulted in the triumph of Christian religion. This period of unprecedented moral revolution has been dubbed the Axial Age, a term coined by German philosopher Karl Jaspers. Though the opinions on the precise dating differ, I think we can safely agree that something happened, and therefore it is very appropriate in this situation to ask, what the hell happened? There is one particular angle that I very much like, which focuses on mathematizing human history through different numerical proxies, measuring the level of development of a human society. And one proxy seems to have a particularly strong link to whether your society is capable of spawning an ethical prophet or not. So, within the upcoming show, we shall treat human history as an especially thrilling session of Sid Meier's Civilization, and we will look into the specific numerical resource a player has to accumulate to spawn Jesus-like character. In many ways, religion is the means through which society worships itself and its way of life. Its function is to keep the notion of an ideal society and an ideal person in the collective consciousness. Through mythology, it demonstrates what a society deems to be as correct mechanisms. It labels the wanted behaviors as virtues and unwanted behaviors as sins. Or it labels the bad ideas taboos and makes them no-no. And of course, throughout all of that, it uses the spiritual framework to triangulate the ineffable transcendental nature of our reality, with the goal of explaining our place in the grand scheme of things and the meaning of it all. Now, precisely what a society deems to be right or wrong behavior depends heavily on the factual situation of said society, be it the climate in which it operates or the technological inventions it has at its disposal. All of these significantly change the strategies a society needs to employ for its survival. It would be misguided to see this simply as some linear development. The path of evolution is complicated. There is underlying development, or the changes of the societal structure. There is, of course, undeniable technological advancement, and the concept of religion evolves with it. But also the universe rarely works in absolute terms. Even failing strategies can survive in seclusion and wait for the right opportunity and the right reinterpretation. For example, it would be utterly false to say that as society develops, religions automatically transition to monotheism. They don't necessarily have to. It depends on perks you unlock in a specific branch of your skill tree. For example, for Japanese Shinto, it sufficed to syncretize with Mahayana Buddhism, and therefore it could avoid the need for monotheistic description of the universe through more abstract conceptualization of the absolute through Zen. Now, to get to our goal of explaining the grand ethical revolution of the Axial Age through specific numerical means, I need to first go through a short overview of religions during the pre-Axial Age. Now, bear in mind, you could spend centuries talking about this, people have, but since I am trying to make a 20-minute something video, I will oversimplify. The two main developmental strategies I want to cover are hunter-gatherer animism and agricultural polytheism. The earliest human societies were of course the hunter-gatherers. These were rather smaller groups, traveling through their favorite biome, where they followed the availability of resources. The earliest goal of such a society was to keep the cohesion of their tribe and group. Their religion and culture revolved around techniques for keeping small tribes functioning. For this reason, their spiritual traditions were strongly linked to ritualism, which permitted essentially performative, theatrical embodiment of tribal ethos. They danced and sang together as an act of signaling that they belonged together and that they conformed to the same customs. In my earlier video, I have already talked about the concept of Dunbar's number, so here is a textual, and it suffices to say that all primate species have some upper limit of members their troop can have. Anything above that number causes excessive stress and, in the worst case, implosion of the group itself. So to put it bluntly, the first and most important goal of primitive religion is to keep a bunch of essentially naked hunter-gatherers from devouring each other. And of course, this is supported by ethical conventions of what is and is not permitted. There are human behaviors which are either in short or long time frames detrimental to groups' survival. So these early societies needed to construct a series of taboos, often things like in-group violence, murder, incest or cannibalism. And finally, the last but not least component of these ancient religions is their strongly psychedelic nature. The religious specialists, shamans, are essentially people tasked with keeping alive the knowledge of both universal mysteries and the functioning of the human mind. Their goal is to guard the mental health of a tribe. In general, this care is achieved through keeping the common tribe members in touch with the ever-present spiritual absolute. Basically, conveying and guarding the mystically achieved knowledge of the omnipresent universal consciousness. And of course, in specific cases, these essentially dedicated psychonauts were responsible for healing those who struggled, mentally or spiritually, with the task of living a life, often transforming them into new shamans in the process. Around 8,000 years BC, the Neolithic Revolution began in the Fertile Crescent region. Smaller groups of hunter-gatherers began to settle down and to adopt sedentary agriculture. This lifestyle spread throughout many of the same regions, which from about 5,000 years BC played a role in formation of large Bronze Age civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India or China. These are also the very same locations where the ethical axial traditions of the first millennia were formulated. This points us in an interesting direction. There is something important about these specific regions that makes them relevant again and again throughout the millennia-long development of human civilization. Now, of course, there are many reasons to be found, but there are two main traits which make these regions predisposed to agricultural prosperity and are coincidentally very important in understanding religions their inhabitants developed to cope with this new strategy of survival. The first is the presence of large rivers with cyclical, predictable flooding patterns. Be it Euphrates, Tigris, Nile, Indus or the Yellow River or Yangtze, all these rivers permitted construction of irrigation canals and related things like dams and floodgates. But for management of such an intricate system, you are dependent not only on the fields and riverbanks in your immediate surroundings. You are forced to cooperate with all other settlements along the river. The system has to work as a whole. This is the reason why the legendary Chinese ruler Yu, the engineer, founded the mythical Xia dynasty after being the first one to successfully control flooding of the Yellow River. The second aspect that prompted formation of large agricultural societies was the presence of nearby nomadic clans, which, if not deterred through large-scale organized military force, just came in and took everything the locals had produced. This arms race between the settled agriculturalists and the roving pillagers was another driving force for formation of these new large civilizations. When you compare this to the older shamanism of hunter-gatherers, a lot has changed in the goals of a society. The smaller tribes coagulated into much larger societies. We see the early urbanization. Administration and taxation suddenly play an absolutely crucial role in management of the society, both for maintenance of irrigation agriculture and for building an army capable of defending it. The sources of stress completely changed, and therefore a necessity for new traditions arose in order to cope with them. You somehow need to keep not only tribes' members from killing each other, but also whole cities. People are also starting to heavily specialize in the newly formed division of labor. Society has to become a machine, in which all cogs need to play their role. And of course, if the flooding of the river fails, for climatic reasons beyond anyone's control, a large-scale famine ensues. Such a society is plunged into interplay of many different actors, and these actors need to be named and comprehended. They need to be ingrained in collective consciousness, which you achieve through mythological means. All those different collaborating cities choose their own patron gods, responsible for ruling over their particular settlement. And beyond that, all different crafts also need to be mythologically described through deities. And finally, even the natural changes of climate need to have their name and personality ascribed to them. Hence, pantheons of different deities for different domains are developed. These are essentially diagrams of everything important a society needs to keep in mind if it is to survive. Together with these elaborate families and courtyard of deities, another religious aspect is developed much more profoundly than in the previous ages. It is the concept of sacrifice. The ritual of sacrifice is essentially a societal vaccination. If you need to keep a society stable through all those readily available crises that can and will arise, people need to keep in mind that it is worth losing something now because it can mean gaining more in the future. Sacrifice is a ritual meant to harden people to the stressful nature of the sedentary agricultural lifestyle of the ancient times. This gives a society certain wiggle room if, let's say, a famine rises. It is sacrifice, struggle that you need to pull through, without necessarily burning and devouring everything around you. Subsequently, the role of religious specialists is of course transformed together with religion. While shamans still do exist, they play a secondary role from the point of view of societal polytheism. The new elites are priests emerging in temples. Their goal is not to manage minutiae of certain tribes. Instead, they need to keep the whole society functioning. They manage and oversee the canonization of mythology, so that it is reliable and comprehensible for all those different integrated cities. And finally, they are also dedicated scholars, developing mathematics and writing systems for the needs of administration and taxation. I have now gone through a short overview of the earliest religious evolution. An interesting trait, which is true for all traditions, is that they are like a chain of succession of ideas. They rarely sever their anchoring to history. The shamans of older animism didn't really go away with the rise of agricultural polytheism. They just became integrated into a larger structure with more encompassing reach and goals. Their role is reimagined and reinterpreted. One framework builds upon another. The agricultural society is still composed of smaller families, tribes, or villages, but the conditions of their survival have changed fundamentally. Their continuation is dependent on conscious collaborative involvement in a larger framework. Now it is time to ask a question. What are the fundamental changes that prompt a human society to transform and evolve their own ethos, their religion and lifestyle? What brings society from one era into another? The first and seemingly most important difference between a society of hunter-gatherers and the one of sedentary farmers is of course the means of acquiring food. Hunter-gatherers are severely limited in their capability of affecting nature itself. They can learn its patterns and follow the trusted paths of their ancestors, knowing from tradition where and how the fish population changes, or which berries will be ripe at a given time and given place. However, there is a finite capacity of edible resources a biome is capable to produce naturally. If your hunter-gatherer culture is too successful, it will reach unsustainable numbers. And hence, if you reach such numbers and still want to ensure your survival, it does not suffice to follow the flow of natural patterns. You need to actively and consciously change them. You suddenly need to decide which animals to breed, where to sow your plants. Hell, you even need to alter the flow of rivers themselves. However, we cannot simply satisfy ourselves with the answer of nourishment. In such a view, things like technological development or intricate trading networks would play only a secondary role. But this does not seem to be the case, especially if we look into more recent times. As much as food makes the basis for societal development, technologies such as writing, the wheel, or later even things like gunpowder or fossil fuels play a much more profound role in evolution of survival strategies. The question is therefore, what is the hidden variable combining both the food we eat and technologies we use to make our lives easier? To the rescue comes British historian and archaeologist Ian Matthew Morris. He is a proponent of an incredibly interesting approach to this question. The thing that connects both food and technology is energy. From a physical point of view, it is hard to get more fundamental and scientific. Specifically, he proposes to measure civilization through a quantitative proxy named energy capture, a value which measures how much energy a society is capable of extracting per capita per day. This value takes into account both how much energy a society gains through agricultural production or how much energy it saves through inventions. All human history then becomes a story of management of energy. For example, if you are capable of producing grains, which then can store energy through winter, not unlike batteries capable of storing energy in the form of electricity. Another question could be, how much energy does a society gains if its trade network works as a well-oiled machine? Realistically, measuring this energy capture, especially for societies of thousands and thousands years ago, will always be a probabilistic task. But that does not mean we have absolutely no idea. Through careful interplay of many sciences such as archaeology, physics, anthropology and many others, we actually can get some numerical answers. A society of hunter-gatherers is capable of capturing around 5,000 kilocalories per capita per day. The Bronze Age agricultural empires were capable of reaching the values of 15,000 kilocalories per capita per day. And through the technological revolution and usage of fossil fuels, these numbers have reached a whopping 230,000 kilocalories per capita per day in the 20th century. Armed with this knowledge, Ian Morris and others tackled the question of axial traditions in an article from 2015 named "Increased Affluence Explains the Emergence of Ascetic Wisdoms and Moralizing Religions." This article compares different proxies that can be used to measure a civilizational progress, such as state population, state surface, or population density. Most of them do not seem to have a really strong connection to the production of ethical reforms. But specifically, energy capture per capita per day seems to have some predictable power. It hovers around 20,000 kilocalories. Essentially, if a society is capable through the means of agriculture, technology, and trade to reach this value, something profound happens with the mentality of its population, and an ethical profit is spawned. Now, we have to ask the question, what actually changes in a society when it reaches these levels of prosperity? In some sense, this can be seen as a triumph of the previous era. The agricultural polytheistic society essentially succeeded immensely. From first settled people who were struggling to cooperate against the forces of nature and barbarians, to a society which, through the ethos of ritual sacrifice and through mastering of their biomes and trade, was capable of achieving an unprecedented stability. This process of mastering polytheistic strategies took, of course, many millennia. The Bronze Age societies, however glorious in their prime, were susceptible. They were, for example, too dependent on the eponymous bronze metal, which was actually quite hard to make. This is an alloy of copper and tin. Both of these resources had to be mined quite far from each other. So to actually make this metal, you need to keep trade networks functioning at all costs, which for many reasons became impossible during the critical time of Bronze Age collapse. A new strategy revolving around iron had to be developed. And iron has the advantage of being one resource. You can just mine it at one place and make your tools right away. Another example is that the writing systems needed to be perfected. Old Mesopotamian cuneiform, which was basically readable pottery, or the primarily spiritual hieroglyphics of ancient Egypt were too impractical for large-scale administration. And this goes, of course, for many other aspects of the agricultural survival strategy. They all needed to be perfected to some degree before a society could reach the levels of prosperity needed for development of new moral religions. In some sense, these levels of development permitted widespread fulfillment of the lower levels of the famous Maslow pyramid. Many stress factors were alleviated. Famines were not so common, and you had a pretty much good shot at stable, happy, harmonic life, at least in comparison with previous eras. In such situations, people can move from short-term strategies, which are coercive and focused on resource gathering, to long-term strategies, which are more collaborative and focused on resource investment. An example would be that you can have less children, but invest more into their education because they are more probable to reach adulthood. Another interesting factor is that rising prosperity also means more profound rise of wealth inequality. In such a situation, it is pretty conceivable for an ordinary craftsman or trader to rise in social status above the norm. And since Pareto distribution is an ever-present principle, the accumulation of wealth and success into hands of few becomes an actual danger to social cohesion. A bunch of hungry lepers and beggars can cause serious damage to both lives of other citizens and to their property, despite the number of limbs they themselves lose in the process. To mitigate these tensions, you need to come up with redistribution efforts, such as charity or alms. And in all that success, you finally have the time to ask the big questions. What is my purpose here? What is the meaning of it all? How am I to behave, to carry on through my life with dignity, despite the somewhat arbitrary success which put me above those poor beggars? To become wealthy and successful is quite a competitive task, maybe even filled with, if not immoral, then at least immensely practical, almost cynical decisions. These societies started to idolize poverty because they somehow felt that they have given up some sort of spiritual purity for physical success. Success which is, of course, immensely useful for fulfilling those lower layers of Maslow's needs. But falter once achieving survival and comfort is not a priority. With all that new time you have on your hands, with all those struggles you and your society had to overcome, you finally can return your attention back to the ancient animistic realization of the Absolute, the realization of the omnipresent spirit of the universe. This is not a new realization. The hunter-gatherers were very much aware of it through shamanic experiences. But throughout all those unstable times of agricultural inventions, it was sort of put on hold. There just was not enough time for personal deep connection with the unifying principle. People were too lost in specific crafts and specific mechanisms they needed to perfect. With all these ingredients together, new axial religions start to make more sense. These are simply philosophies for people who have already fulfilled their own basic needs and are prepared to work for the moral betterment of society at large and for salvation of their own soul. They have some certainty that they will survive their life. Now, they want to live it fully. At the beginning of this video, I have stated that the Axial Age is roughly dated to the period of 8th to 2nd century BC. Of course, creation of many ethical religions falls outside of this specific period. On one side, the pharaoh Akhenaten was experimenting with monotheistic solar religion of god Aten in 14th century BC, but this experiment was ahead of its time and was short-lived. On the other side, we have of course the famous prophets Jesus Christ and Mohammed. Partially, I think this can be somewhat attributed to the fact that the factor of energy capture is something that happens in different regions at different times. I would expect this to be the case for Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century after Christ. But as far as Jesus himself goes, I think his specific reformation and subsequent meteoric rise of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire was a little bit different. The Roman Empire managed to keep their polytheism well above the level of 20,000 calories of energy capture. And this created a situation of spiritual vacuum. Roman religion was under harsh societal critique for a very long time. In some sense, it really overstayed its welcome, which is also corroborated by the number of different mystery cults developing all throughout its territories, trying to find an alternative. But despite all of that, Romans seem to have been really capable of keeping their idea of culture and social ethos. In some sense, I think it is fair to say that Jesus Christ represented sort of a second-generation Axial Age. He was already born into a transformed world, where ethical religions and philosophies did exist. However, none of them were capable of actually taking societal hegemony. Romans still did their ancient, outdated sacrifices in the style of agricultural polytheists. It is not a coincidence that it was a story of craftsmen, a carpenter, who symbolically ended the age of large-scale agricultural sacrifices by making one himself. A voluntary, ultimate personal sacrifice to both prove that the society already learned its lesson and that there are more important things in this universe than material success.